It happened on Christmas Eve, at my own dining table, surrounded by the smell of pine and cinnamon and the soft glow of candles I had lit myself. The turkey was still warm. Wine was poured. And across from me, a 29-year-old man named Derek Allen Caulfield slid a manila folder across my grandmother's tablecloth and told me with a smile that never reached his eyes that if I wanted to keep my family together, I would sign over my home. My home. The house my late husband Walter and I built over 32 years. The house where my daughter Rachel took her first steps. The house with the cracked tile in the second bathroom that Walter never got around to fixing and that I never had fixed either because some things you keep as they are. That house. This boy wanted that house. And before I could say a word, my daughter, my Rachel, who was sitting to my right with her hands folded tightly in her lap, pressed a small folded piece of paper into my palm under the table. I did not open it immediately. I kept my eyes on Derek. I kept smiling. And I said in the voice I spent 26 years perfecting on the federal bench, "Derek, that is very interesting. Tell me more." My name is Evelyn Grace Harmon. I am 64 years old. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a 4-bedroom craftsman home on a half-acre of land that has been in my family's care for over 3 decades. I am retired. Before I retired, I was a United States Federal District Court judge for the Western District of North Carolina. I served on that bench for 26 years. Before that, I spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor and 4 before that as a clerk for the Fourth Circuit. In total, I spent nearly 4 decades watching people lie to me professionally. I have heard every variety of lie that human beings are capable of producing. Lies told by corporation executives in $3,000 suits. Lies told by people with nothing left to lose. Lies told by charming, attractive, well-dressed young men who thought that a woman of a certain age, in a certain kind of grief, could be made to feel so grateful for approval that she would not notice what was being done to her. They were always wrong. Derek Caulfield would be no different, but I am getting ahead of myself, because before any of this happened, there was a before. And in the before, I was simply a woman who had retired from the most defining work of her life, who had lost her husband of 32 years to pancreatic cancer 18 months prior, and who was, in the slow and unglamorous way that grief actually works, trying to figure out what came next. Walter Harmon died in April 2 years ago. He was 66. He had been healthy, or so we thought, until the January before, when he started losing weight without trying and complained about a dull ache behind his ribs that he kept attributing to indigestion. 3 months from diagnosis to death. That is how pancreatic cancer works sometimes. It does not negotiate. It does not give you time to prepare. One day you are planning your retirement garden, and then you are sitting in a hospital chair holding a hand that is getting lighter every day, and then you are alone in a house that is too quiet. I had retired from the bench 6 months before his diagnosis. The timing felt in those early months of grief, either like the cruelest irony or the most precise mercy, depending on which hour of the day I was having. I had retired so we could travel. We had a list. Portugal was first. We never went. What I did instead was grieve. I went to therapy twice a week. I took walks every morning. I cooked dinner for myself every night, even when it felt absurd to do so for one person, because Walter had always said that the act of cooking was a form of self-respect. I called Rachel on Sundays. Rachel. My daughter. She was 31 at the time all of this began. She worked as a graphic designer in Charlotte, about 2 hours from Asheville. She had inherited her father's warmth and her mother's precision. She had handled Walter's death with a kind of quiet steadiness that made me immeasurably proud and also quietly worried, because steadiness sometimes meant something was being held rather than released. She had been single for most of the 2 years since Walter died. Until September, when she called on a Sunday and her voice had a different quality to it. Lighter, more careful, both at once. "Mom," she said, "I've been seeing someone. I want you to meet him." His name was Derek. He was 29, or so he said. He was in real estate development, or so he said. Rachel told me he was different from anyone I've dated before. She said it with such careful emphasis that I noted it and filed it away. I met Derek for the first time in October at a dinner at Rachel's apartment in Charlotte. He arrived 15 minutes late, which he acknowledged with a smile so immediately disarming that I found myself almost forgiving him before he had sat down. That was the first thing I noticed, the smoothness of it. The way the apology arrived already polished like it had been practiced. He was physically striking. Tall, lean, with dark hair styled to look effortless. He had what I can only describe as a face designed for first impressions, symmetrical, open, warm. He shook my hand with both of his and said, "Rachel has told me so much about you, and I have been genuinely looking forward to this." Dinner was pleasant. Derek was charming in the way that certain people are charming as a skill rather than a quality. He asked me about my career with what seemed like genuine interest. He knew I had been a federal judge. He asked intelligent questions, not too many, not too few. And yet, the first flag was small. When I asked about his most recent project, he gave me an answer that was detailed and confident, and when I reflected on it later, contained almost no verifiable specifics. It was the kind of answer that sounds like substance and is in fact only the shape of substance. After 26 years on the bench, I knew that shape very well. The second flag came when Rachel got up to get dessert and Derek and I were briefly alone. The warmth in his face shifted slightly, not into coldness, into nothing. A brief neutral nothing, like a screensaver coming on when no one is watching. It lasted less than 3 seconds. When Rachel came back, the warmth was back instantly, but I had seen it. I drove home that night and told myself I was being overprotective. That Rachel was 31 and intelligent and capable of evaluating her own relationships. I should not have told myself any of those things. In November, Derek began spending weekends in Asheville. He admired the house often, too often, I would later realize. One Saturday afternoon, standing on the back porch, he said, "This place is incredible, Evelyn." The lot alone must be worth, he stopped himself, smiled. "Sorry, old habit, occupational hazard." I remember thinking, that is a strange self-correction. It was during one of those November weekends that I met Lorraine Caulfield, Derek's mother. He brought her unexpectedly, or what he presented as unexpectedly. She had been passing through Asheville on her way somewhere else. Lorraine was 57, immaculately dressed, and the most precisely calibrated social performer I had ever met outside of a courtroom. She wore expensive jewelry that wasn't flashy. She had silver hair in an elegant wave. And she complimented my home with the specific vocabulary of someone who understood that targeted flattery is more effective than general flattery. "The exposed beams are original, aren't they?" she said, looking up at my ceiling. "You don't see that kind of craftsmanship anymore." A pause. Walter chose well. Walter's name, unprompted, on a first meeting. Rachel had told Derek about Walter, of course, that was natural. But the way Lorraine deployed the name, with that particular blend of familiarity and sympathy, was not the act of a woman who happened to know a detail. It was the act of a woman who had been briefed. Lunch lasted 3 hours. Lorraine was warm and gracious, and subtly, expertly, began weaving a narrative about how family was everything, and how she admired women who had built something lasting, something real, something that could be passed on. She looked at my house when she said that last part. When they left that afternoon, I stood in my kitchen and felt something I had not felt in a professional capacity in several years. The particular cold clarity that comes when a case that has seemed scattered suddenly begins to have shape. I felt it. And then, because I was tired and grieving and lonely in the way that people who have been married a long time become lonely when they are suddenly not, I set it aside. That was my mistake. I own it fully. In December, Derek and Rachel announced they would both come for Christmas. Lorraine was also invited. Derek mentioned it as Rachel stood nearby nodding, but her nods were the slightly too large nods of someone who is agreeing harder than they feel. They arrived on the 23rd. Rachel was quieter than usual. She hugged me for a beat longer than she normally did. Christmas Eve dinner. I had cooked all day. The table was set with Walter's mother's china. The candles were lit. It was the kind of Christmas Eve that Walter and I had always made together, and making it alone this year had taken more from me than I let on. We sat down. We toasted. We passed dishes. It was after the main course, that specific pause in a Christmas dinner when everyone is warm and full and slightly softened, that Derek reached beside his chair and brought up the manila folder. He placed it on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed the motion. Then he looked at me and said, "Evelyn, I hope you'll take this in the spirit it's intended. I love your daughter. I want to build a life with her." And I think the most honest way to do that is to have an honest conversation about family assets and how we all benefit from making smart decisions together. I looked at Rachel. She was looking at the table. Derek opened the folder. Inside was a document with the superficial trappings of legal formality, headers, numbered sections, a signature line. Beside it was a property valuation. The number on it was familiar. It was, give or take a few thousand, the approximate current market value of my home. He talked for approximately 8 minutes. The structure of his argument was this: he and Rachel were planning to marry. They wanted to invest in real estate together. They needed capital or collateral. The most logical source of that collateral was my home, which I, a 64-year-old widow living alone, did not fully need. He was proposing that I sign the property over to a jointly held LLC. In exchange, I would be entitled to live in the home for the duration of my reasonable occupancy. The amount, $1.2 million. There were itemized documents, a projected return schedule, a cover page with a company logo, Caulfield Residential Partners, LLC. It was, I will say, one of the more elaborate presentations I had ever seen for what was, at its core, a very old and simple scheme. Dress it up in whatever font you like. It was still a person sitting at my table on Christmas Eve trying to take my house. Lorraine, throughout this presentation, said nothing. But her silence was not passive. It was managerial. When Derek finished, she spoke. "Evelyn," she said gently, "we know this is a lot to take in, but Derek and Rachel have been planning this together for weeks. This is her future we're talking about, and I think Walter would have wanted her to be secure." Walter's name again, and it was at that precise moment, with Walter's name being used as leverage over his own table with his mother's china beneath this folder in his house, that I felt Rachel's hand find mine under the tablecloth and press a small folded piece of paper into my palm. I closed my fingers around it. I did not look down. I did not change my expression. I smiled at Derek. I smiled at Lorraine. I said, in the voice I use when I am giving nothing away while taking everything in, "This is quite a presentation. I'll need some time to review the documents properly, as I'm sure you understand. Why don't we have dessert and continue this tomorrow?" Derek glanced at Lorraine. She gave almost no visible response, just the faintest tilt of her head. He looked back at me and smiled. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need." I excused myself to get the dessert. In the kitchen, with the door half closed behind me, I unfolded the paper. It was written in Rachel's handwriting. Small and fast and slightly uneven, the way writing looks when your hand is shaking. It said, "Mom, he's a scammer. I found out 3 days ago. I'm scared. Please don't sign anything. I'll explain everything." "I'm so sorry." I read it twice. I folded it back up and put it in the pocket of my cardigan. I stood at my kitchen counter for 30 seconds with my eyes closed. I breathed slowly. I let myself feel briefly and fully the combination of fear and fury and grief and love that was trying to surface. I acknowledged it, and then I set it aside because I had work to do. I plated the apple pie. I carried it out with a smile. I spent another hour at that table being warm and pleasant and mildly enthusiastic about the proposal, asking just enough questions to suggest genuine consideration without tipping my hand. Derek relaxed. Lorraine relaxed. By the end of the evening, they were both, I could tell, feeling confident. That confidence was the first tool I had. Rachel and I did not speak that night. I went to bed and I did not sleep. I lay in the dark in the room where Walter and I had slept for 30 years, and I thought about everything I had dismissed. The self-corrections about property values, the precise use of Walter's name, the managerial silence of Lorraine Caulfield, the way Rachel's nods had been too large. 3 days she had been sitting with that knowledge in this house, next to that man, waiting for a moment to warn me. I felt a surge of something I cannot fully name even now. Pride in her courage, rage on her behalf, and guilt, deep, specific guilt, that I had made her wait even an hour longer than she needed to. I had been so careful not to interfere, so mindful of her autonomy, so sophisticated about it. And in being sophisticated, I had been slow. I held that thought for a long time in the dark. I did not flinch from it. And then I put it somewhere it could wait, because the work came first. At 6:15 on Christmas morning, I texted Martin Calloway. Martin had been the finest investigator the Federal Public Defender's Office in our district had ever employed, which I knew because for 26 years I had watched his work come across my bench. He was retired now and ran a private practice. He did not celebrate Christmas. I texted, "Martin, I need you today if possible. I have a name and an LLC. It's personal." He replied in 11 minutes, "Coffee first, then everything." I also texted Diane Fuller, who had been my law clerk for 3 years and was now one of the most respected estate and property attorneys in the Western District. I sent her a photograph of Derek's document. I said, "Need your eyes on this. Today." She replied 40 minutes later, "There are 4 problems in the first 2 paragraphs alone. Call me when you can." At 9 o'clock on Christmas morning, while Derek was in the shower and Lorraine had not yet arrived, Rachel came downstairs and sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me everything. She had found out 3 days before Christmas. She had been on Derek's laptop. He had asked her to print something. She had his password. There was nothing covert about the access, and in finding the file, she had seen other files. A folder named Asheville. Her mother's initials, her mother's city. Inside that folder was a complete dossier, property records for my home, my full legal name and date of birth, a brief biography that included my retirement date, Walter's death date, and the note. Recent widow, emotionally vulnerable, no remaining immediate family except one daughter. There were drafts of the document he had brought to dinner. There were notes from a phone call with Lorraine, dated 3 weeks prior, that included the line, "Target has significant assets and emotional isolation. Timeline aggressive but viable." Target, her mother, Target. Rachel told me this with her hands flat on the table and her voice very steady and her eyes very bright, and I watched my child hold herself together with the same discipline I had tried to model for her entire life. "How long?" I asked. "I think since the beginning," she said. "I think he chose me because of you." I reached across the table and put both my hands over hers. "You are not responsible for what he did," I said. "Not one piece of it." She nodded, her eyes spilled over briefly. Then she pulled herself straight and said, "What do we do?" "We do exactly what we did yesterday," I said. "We give them nothing to see." I spent Christmas Day in a state of bifurcated consciousness that looks from the outside like serenity and feels from the inside like running 2 computers simultaneously. I made waffles. I exchanged gifts. I laughed at Derek's joke about the weather. I watched Lorraine watch me and reflected back to her exactly what she wanted to see, a woman who was softening, a woman who was coming around. Underneath that, I was working every resource I had. At 2 in the afternoon, Martin called. What he gave me over the next 45 minutes was this. Derek Allen Caulfield was 31, not 29. He had 2 prior names on record, one a legal name change, one an alias. Caulfield Residential Partners, LLC had been incorporated 11 months ago in Delaware, had no verified assets, no active projects, and had been used in at least 3 prior approaches that Martin had found documented in civil records. The first victim was a woman in Roanoke, Virginia, 68, recently widowed. Derek had dated her niece for 4 months before the family investment presentation. The niece eventually figured it out, but not before the woman transferred $68,000 into the LLC. She never saw it again. The second was a woman in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 61, recently divorced. Her son had dated Derek for 3 months. She filed a civil complaint documenting $43,000 in losses and an attempted property transfer that failed only because her attorney flagged it before signing. The third was a woman in Knoxville, Tennessee, 70, a widow. Her granddaughter had dated Derek for 6 months. This woman had actually signed an initial agreement before her attorney caught the fraud. She lost $22,000 in fees before the thing was unwound. 3 previous victims. Total documented losses, $133,000. In each case, the pattern was identical. A romantic relationship with a younger family member, a period of trust building, a formal presentation of a family investment opportunity at a domestic setting, an accomplice present to apply emotional pressure, and Lorraine Caulfield in every single case. "Evelyn," Martin said, "this is a federal wire fraud pattern with interstate elements. This is not a civil matter." "I know," I said. "You know someone at the U.S. Attorney's Office." "Martin," I said gently, "I spent 26 years receiving their filings." Over the next 3 days, I assembled everything. Martin continued pulling records. Diane prepared a complete legal analysis. I contacted James Ockhaffer, a former colleague and federal prosecutor, and provided him with Martin's findings. He called me back within 2 hours and used the words compelling pattern and strong predicate, and we would like to proceed. Derek and Lorraine, meanwhile, continued their campaign. Derek raised the subject of the document twice more, and I expressed warm but methodical deliberation each time. Lorraine deployed grief twice more, Walter's name once, and once a long speech about how isolated women who held onto the past sometimes missed opportunities to invest in the future. She looked at my house when she said, "Invest in the future." On the morning of the 28th, Derek raised the timeline. The investment window was limited. He hoped we could wrap this up before he and Rachel drove back to Charlotte. I said with a small apologetic smile, "Derek, I think I need to meet with my attorney before I sign anything. I'm sure you understand old habits from 30 years in the legal system. Why don't we set up a formal meeting somewhere neutral? Bring all your documentation. I'd love to have my attorney present so she can ask the technical questions I might miss." He agreed immediately, too immediately. We set it for December 30th. Derek proposed a location, an office suite in downtown Asheville, which he described as the offices of a firm he collaborated with. Diane confirmed within an hour that the suite had been rented on a 3-day short-term basis through a shared workspace company. It was essentially a stage set. Of course it was. December 30th arrived. I wore the dark charcoal suit I had worn for my final day on the bench. I met Diane at the building entrance 20 minutes early. She brought 2 colleagues, both former federal prosecutors. Martin was present with a complete physical file organized in 4 tabbed binders. Federal agents confirmed they would be available in a vehicle outside, not to make an immediate arrest, but to observe and create a contemporaneous federal witness record. We went upstairs. I sat at the head of the table. I folded my hands. I waited. Derek and Lorraine arrived 7 minutes late. Derek was in an expensive suit I had not seen before, the kind of suit you wear when you plan to close. They both looked at the 3 attorneys and Martin and his binders, and for a fraction of a moment something moved across Derek's face before the professional warmth replaced it. That fraction was enough. He recovered smoothly. He shook hands. He said, "I'm so glad we could all sit down together." "I do have questions," I said, "but first I'd like to share something with you." I nodded to Martin. He opened the first binder and placed the first page in front of Derek, the civil complaint from Roanoke, the victim's name, the dollar amount, the date. Derek looked at it. His face did not change. "I'm not sure what this has to do with." I placed my hand lightly on the table. He stopped. "Patricia Whitmore," I said. "Roanoke, Virginia, 68 years old, recently widowed when you met her niece. $68,000. I nodded to Martin. He placed the second page. "Carol Ann Bridges, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 61, $43,000, an attempted property transfer not unlike the one you proposed to me." The third page, Dorothy Ellen Graves, Knoxville, Tennessee, 70 years old, $22,000 in fees and legal costs before her attorney caught the transfer language. That case is still open in Tennessee. I paused. "In each case, Lorraine, you were present," I said, looking at her directly. "Your role appears to be operational, target research, emotional pressure, timeline management. You identified me as a target. I saw your notes." Something happened to Lorraine Caulfield's face. The silver elegance of it seemed to tighten, and underneath the tightening there was something that had never been warmth. Derek looked at the binders, 3 of them still closed. He was doing the math. "Derek," I said, "Caulfield Residential Partners, LLC was incorporated 11 months ago in Delaware. It has no assets, no active projects, and no licensed real estate activity in any jurisdiction. The document you brought to my home on Christmas Eve contains 5 provisions that constitute fraud under North Carolina General Statute and triggers federal wire fraud exposure due to its interstate character. These are not my opinions. These are the conclusions of 3 attorneys who have reviewed both the document and the full record." The warmth was gone from Derek's face entirely now. What was underneath was flat and cold, and for the first time honest. He said, with a control that was visibly fraying, "You're a retired judge who has been alone for 2 years and can't stand to see her daughter build something without her." I heard Diane inhale beside me. I kept my face very still. I understand you're frightened, I said. That was frightened people's language. It was also recorded. I held up my phone, showing the active recording. As has this entire meeting. That is legal in North Carolina under single-party consent, as I'm sure your attorney will confirm when you have one. Lorraine stood up. This is harassment, she said. Her voice had lost the Virginia lilt entirely. What was underneath was flat and entirely real. We have done nothing wrong. Then you'll be fine, I said. They left. Derek's chair scraped the floor. Lorraine's heels were sharp and fast in the hallway. The door closed. I sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. Well, said Martin, sliding a summary page to James Ockhaffer's associate. That's on the record. Derek Allen Caulfield was arrested 6 weeks later on federal wire fraud charges spanning 3 states and 4 documented victims. 4, because by the time the investigation concluded, a 4th woman had been identified. A 73-year-old widow from Bristol, Virginia, who had been too embarrassed to come forward until Martin's work made contact with her possible. She had lost $31,000. 4 women. Total documented losses, $164,000, and my home, which had never left my possession. Lorraine Caulfield was charged as co-conspirator. The federal prosecutors documented her role as the operational architect of the entire scheme. Derek entered a guilty plea in September. 11 years in federal prison. Lorraine was convicted by jury in November. 7 years. The 4 victims were named in the restitution order. I attended Lorraine's sentencing, not because I had to, because I wanted the 4 women to know that someone who could have shown up for them. Rachel spent 3 weeks in Asheville after it was over. We cooked together every night. One evening she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, with the careful precision she always uses when something matters, "Mom, I knew something was wrong from the first month. I just didn't want to know it out loud." I understood that in a way I could not fully articulate. There are things we see clearly and choose not to see out loud. That is human. That is not weakness. It is the cost of hope. You saw it when it mattered, I said. You told me when you could. She leaned across the table and hugged me. In the warmth of that hug and the familiar weight of my daughter, I felt something ease that had been tight since the previous April. Not disappear. Ease, the way a door opens enough to let the light change. What I learned in 26 years on the federal bench is this: the people who build schemes like Derek and Lorraine's are not extraordinary. They are simply people who have learned that grief creates softness, and that softness in the wrong hands looks like opportunity. They are counting on the fact that you will be too kind, too hopeful, too much yourself to see what they are. What they never account for is this: the people who have survived the deepest losses do not become soft. They become still. And in the stillness, if you are paying attention, you can hear everything. The cracked tile in the second bathroom is still there. I have decided it can stay.